We're live now.
Excellent. Good afternoon. This is February 2nd, 2023, or it is February 2nd, 2023. And this is Senate Government Operations Committee, and we are talking about sheriffs today, both Prop 1 and S17. A proposed constitutional amendment and a proposed bill related to the oversight of sheriffs. So we have joining us our Chief Counsel, Jen Carby, and she's going to walk us through the constitutional amendment and then just sort of talk with us about constitutional issues related to elected officials, etc. So thank you, Jen.
Thank you. So Jennifer Carby, Legislative Counsel. We are looking at PR1, the proposed amendment 1 to the Vermont Constitution, which I think is on your webpage. So it starts off with the purpose. The proposal would amend the Vermont Constitution to allow the General Assembly to establish by law qualifications for individuals to be elected to and hold the office of sheriff. Currently, there are no specific qualifications for being a sheriff in Vermont, including no requirement that a sheriff have or maintain law enforcement officer certification. And then it gets into which provision of the Constitution. It's section 50 of chapter 2. It would be amended. And there are 3 types of county officers addressed in section 50. So this is the middle paragraph on sheriffs. Under the existing constitutional provision at the top of page 2, sheriffs shall be elected by the voters of their respective districts. This is established by law. This is the existing provision. Their term of office shall be 4 years and shall commence on the first day of February next after their election. And this would add language saying the General Assembly may establish by law qualifications for the election to and holding of such office. I'll note this language, that underlined language is the same language that appears in the next section of the Constitution for probate judges, although it appears in the middle of the provision there, and this one would add it at the end. As far as the effective date, this is kind of the standard effective date for constitutional amendments. I don't know if you've gone through the constitutional amendment process, but there is a time lock in the Constitution that says it can only be amended every other biennium. So amendments can be proposed during this 23-24 biennium. They would need to be adopted in the Senate by 2/3 vote, and then in the House in this biennium, and then approved again by both chambers in the next biennium, and then they would go to the voters in November for approval or not. So this provision, the effective date says that the amendment would become part of the Constitution on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November 2026, when ratified and adopted by the people of this state in accordance with the provisions of 17 VSA Chapter 32, which spells out some of how that process works.
Excellent. Well, first, are there questions for Jen about the constitutional amendment process? Because we haven't actually gone through that. So I know we have new legislators.
Great handout from years past from my predecessors in handling constitutional issues. So we can certainly get that to you. Betsy M did it, Cameron.
Yeah.
Committees last biennium.
That would be great, and we can send it to everybody and then also post it so that you all know. I'm specifically looking at Senator Watson because you haven't been here at all for any of these votes, but even Senator Vihoski, who wasn't here for the full previous, and Senator Norris weren't here for the full previous constitutional amendment processes. So do you have any questions?
Well, thankfully, having gone through some recent constitutional amendments and reading up about that, I feel generally pretty
okay.
Like I know how this works, but I am curious about the specifics of the November 2026, because if it is passed in the first year of the next biennium, which would be 2025,
26.
Right, but the first year of it is 25. Why wouldn't it be November 25?
First year is this year.
No, let's let Jen answer.
So there generally wouldn't be a general election until November 2026. So I think from a practical standpoint, to get the biggest turnout, they're usually held as part of the general.
Okay. Thank you.
It
Yeah,
may not be a presidential year, but it's the next big general election year.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does,
Yeah.
yes, thank you.
Okay, and we usually, I often, or last time, at least, I don't think this has to be this, I don't think, Jen, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. The Senate did it in the first year of the biennium and the House did it in the second year of the biennium each time, so it's over a 4-year process, I believe, for the 2 previous constitutional amendments that
But
we
it's,
just.
right, but it's not required.
It's not
just
required,
really
okay.
saying it.
And then it gets voted on afterwards. Senator Clarkson.
But I just want to clarify, because there are different votes required, there are different thresholds in each biennium. So in the first biennium, it has to be passed by the House and the Senate, right? By 2/3, is
I
that
think
correct?
it is just the Senate that is 2/3. Let me pull up the provision from the Constitution.
Oh, I
Um,
thought there was a equally high bar for the House.
So let's see, so it is, the Senate by vote of 2/3 may propose amendments with the concurrence of a majority of the members of the House.
Right.
And then
And then
it's referred to the next session and a majority of the members of the Senate and a majority of the
right,
members.
so then it's, right,
Okay, so the 2/3 threshold is just for the first
To
Senate.
get out of, right.
and then just in the first biennium.
And also, once it passes the Senate, it cannot be amended, right?
That's right.
But it could be amended on the floor of the Senate if.
Yes, I believe it can be amended until it is adopted by the Senate and then it gets frozen there.
But the House cannot amend it at
No.
all.
No.
Never,
No.
no.
The House doesn't like
Unlike,
this part.
right, and they can only start in the Senate, so only senators can propose amendments to the Vermont Constitution. And only senators can make changes to that proposal in the first time.
First year, so the second time the Senate gets it, we can change it, so. Okay, so that's the process. Any other process questions? Senator Norris, did you have one?
Well, I got a
You
couple
have-
of questions, some of the process questions.
Okay. Senator Clarkson, process?
Well, just history, which you alluded to, and I just want to clarify, probate, these qualifications got changed by constitutional amendment with the probate judges. And what was the year of that?
1974, they were proposed in 1971, they
Oh.
were,
And we have still not done this for assistant judges.
the only,
We did something for assistant judges, but we require them to be better educated about stuff.
I think there are some, maybe some provisions around their duties that were changed. Their judicial function shall be established by law is what the assistant judges says.
Yeah, so
The
there,
judicial functions, so that's sort of the additional language on the assistant judges.
Yeah, because we lost it.
right, so I guess now we're getting into content questions.
No,
So,
the 74 was what I wanted. probate.
But yeah, so the 4 county officers, probate judges, we can require their qualification, assistant judges, their duties, but only their judicial duties as judges, not their executive duties as
Their judicial function,
their
which may be
judicial
somewhat
functions.
different from duties.
Okay, and then both sheriffs and state's attorneys, there's no additional language that allows the legislature to make
That's right.
anything. Okay, Senator Norris, go ahead.
Where to begin? Jen, there is absolutely no other way to initiate oversight over the office of sheriff other than a constitutional amendment.
Depends what you mean by oversight over the office, to establish qualifications for, to be elected to the office. What is in the Constitution, the majority of courts around the country, the Vermont Supreme Court doesn't seem to have really weighed in on this question, hasn't come up for them, but have said whatever is in your Constitution is the limit, and our Constitution requires only that you be a voter in the state of Vermont. So there are no, so that doesn't leave room for the legislature to add additional qualifications.
I believe the problem that we're facing here is not the qualifications of the sheriff, and this is kind of vague in its writing here, because I don't know what the qualifications are going to be. We haven't established that as of yet. But I believe that the process is, okay, we've got maybe 1 or 2 or 3 counties that we're saying, this isn't in the best interest of our communities at large or counties at large. And I've heard things from they should have stepped down to the impeachment process, whatever else. I thought that's what we were discussing as to how can legislator have oversight over these particular offices who perform functions within our county government or lack thereof, something like that.
I think it, again, depends what you mean by oversight. So there are certain things you can do around budgets, around duties, but as far as qualifications and who can be the sheriff and who can't or can no longer be the sheriff, the way the Constitution is written, there are no qualifications required other than to be a voter in the state of Vermont, and removal is only by impeachment.
So this proposal doesn't change that.
Right.
It simply says qualifications for sheriffs.
This says, this would allow the General Assembly to establish qualifications for election to and holding of the office. So this doesn't establish those qualifications. It just empowers the General Assembly to enact laws that do.
Which is, if, say, we want to look at impeachment or whatever else, does this proposal cover that?
This doesn't change anything about impeachment, so you could still impeach if that was the choice. I was just talking to the chair before the committee meeting and thinking you may want to look at adding language in here that's a little bit more specific around the removal. So that might say something like, may establish by law qualifications for the election to and holding of such office and for removal for failure to meet or maintain the qualifications.
That's the gist of the whole conversation. This doesn't really meet what we've been discussing,
Yeah.
or not.
We
Okay.
can change it. We
Right.
can change it. And literally Jen and I just were talking about this as we were walking down the hall. So if that's something the committee would like to include in the language so that it makes the removal process easier than impeachment, that's certainly something that we could add to this. Because right now, the only way to remove a sheriff is through impeachment, and this wouldn't change that. So we could change that.
Right, so
I'll
this-
try to- I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, well, this language was modeled on what is in existence in in the Constitution for probate judges as a place to start. It doesn't mean it's a place to end our conversation for what you want the language to say. That's just the reason that it says what it says, is starting by looking at, are there any other constitutional officers for whom the General Assembly has that authority? Yes, probate judges, so we use that language, but in looking into it further and trying to understand, and I want to continue to try to understand, as I've looked into it further, it's my understanding that probate judges cannot be removed other than through impeachment, even though the General Assembly can set their qualifications. And so if that's the case, then I agree that this language by itself doesn't get you out of the only choice is impeachment route.
So I'll try to limit my questions.
No, but we want to answer all the questions. Go ahead, Bob. Senator Norris.
So then if we have other, we'll refer to them as county positions, for lack of a better term in the state of Vermont. Are those, of those 5 positions, are they all constitutionally elected officers? Probate, high bailiff, assistant judges, sheriff, and state's attorneys?
Yes, although high bailiff is only sort of mentioned in passing once, but I believe it is in the position about being elected, so yes,
Those are constitutionally elected positions?
yes.
So then I guess the next question would be then, rather than revisit this 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road, if we had to, obviously, why don't we at least as a committee consider just doing a clean sweep here, so to speak, of the constitutionally elected positions? Because we could be, and hopefully not, revisiting that same thing 2 or 3 years down the road. So that's just something to think about. And my other question is, the way that this reads is the General Assembly to establish law qualifications for individuals to be elected and hold the office of sheriff. What does that mean? Is there going to be a committee formed on this, or what are the qualifications? What am I voting on here? You know?
So and I'll let Jen speak to this too, but the qualifications aren't listed in the Constitution.
Right.
What this would allow is the future legislature to enact a law that would establish what those qualifications are. And they could be whatever the legislature at that time deems as appropriate qualifications. So it could be certified law enforcement officer. It could be maintain residency in the state of Vermont. It could be not be convicted of a felony. It could be, it could be a number of things. So, but this the Constitution generally lays out the broad concepts, and then the details are in legislation and statute.
So, and I'll try to end it with this.
No, you're fine.
I think that there needs to be oversight in all elected positions. It's unfortunate that we're having this discussion. I can tell you right now that I'm not keen on another constitutional change or amendment, because I feel that sometimes we just treat this as a piece of paper and we just do what we want with it, and that's not what it stands for. So that's why I started out, Jim, would say there's absolutely no other way that we can, other than Prop 1 or constitutional amendment, change these elected positions as far as how we can deal with these individuals in the future.
As far as who can be in the office and how to get them out
Yeah,
if they're not, no.
that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges.
So I'll yield the floor.
No,
President.
that's okay. I want to make sure everybody has their questions answered and that we're moving forward in a way that we, hopefully all of us can support. So Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Hardy. So my question is in regards to kind of a similar vein, which is this language doesn't preclude us from being able to change things, but it doesn't specify what we can change. So like we could move forward with changing how they're elected or removed with this language.
I'm not sure I'm understanding.
So I thought that this was broad enough that we could still do like the changes if someone was being impeached or not. We could change that process with this language. But what I'm hearing from you is no.
I think what Jen was saying is that if we wanted to have oversight of their removal, we need to add language.
We do need to add.
Yeah, that was something that Jen and I just talked about as we were walking down the hall to come to committee.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
think once you start to look at the mechanics of what does it look like to set qualifications and what happens if somebody doesn't meet them without affirmatively having removal authority and a removal process, that's where you start to run into maybe being left back with impeachment.
Okay. So yeah, I guess I had first taken this language to be very broad, kind of giving us the opportunity to do that. And based on this discussion, that's not true. Okay.
I thought that was
Okay.
well, and
I think that's what we had thought going in because of the language on the probate judges, but in thinking more about what it would really look like to set up a process to remove somebody, it wasn't clear that just setting their qualifications gave you enough room to make or enough room to unambiguously have the authority to make a process for removal.
Yeah, and I think both Jen and I misunderstood what had happened, or at least I did, with the probate judge that was just, I thought that person was removed from office, but apparently they were not removed from office. They just got there.
I think we should get some more clarification
Yeah, well,
from the judiciary, but in talking with one of my colleagues who works on judiciary and judicial retention issues, it's my understanding that there is language in the Constitution that gives the Vermont Supreme Court a lot more authority to discipline members of the court, members of the judiciary than you have for these kinds of officers. So there is some more latitude to do discipline short of removal. But I also understood from him that that probate judge or other probate judges could not be removed from office. I believe he was, from what I was reading yesterday, that he was prohibited from sitting on the bench and that his salary was suspended.
But it wasn't.
But he wasn't removed. And, based on some case law in other states, that may be sort of constructive removal, but there is that broader authority for the courts in the Constitution.
Nor was he reelected.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess my only other follow-up question then would be if we're being specific and we were to add something around the removal process and that's something we'd like to investigate, does that then limit our ability to do other things in any way? Like if we specify, I don't know, like I guess I'm now nervous that we are going to make it appear that that's the only reason or like the only thing we want to change. And that's not the my understanding of our goal with the bill that we're trying to pass is there's a series of things that we're working to address.
Yeah, and I think the language that Jen had suggested, can you read it again?
Yes, so it would revise the language to say the General Assembly may establish by law qualifications for the election to and holding of such office and for removal from office for failure to meet or maintain these qualifications.
Okay, so it doesn't then just limit us to that.
No,
Okay.
it's an and.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
And I think a lot of the things.
Sorry for the slow
No, no,
roll on
no,
understanding.
I think a number of the things you're working on in the bill that Tim is working on with you are things you can do now.
Okay.
And this wouldn't change that. This is just broadening your ability to legislate in this area in the future.
Thank you.
right, and the whole thing started with me working with Tim on a bill, and he kept saying, oh, no, you can't do that, you can't do that. So then I was like, well, how can I do that? And then you have to amend the Constitution, and that's sort of how we ended up here with these two paths, a short path and a long path.
Cool, thank you.
Senator Clarkson.
So Jan, we have set in, we have changed, we've done amendments to change the ability to set qualifications for all of the constitutional officers. I'm just tagging on to what Bob has raised. We have done it for state's attorneys, probate judges, and who else?
I don't think you've done anything for state's attorneys.
So state's attorneys still don't have to be
They
lawyers.
do not have to be lawyers.
Probate judges have to be
They don't
lawyers.
have to be lawyers.
Assistant judges don't have to be lawyers.
No.
And state's attorneys don't have to, and sheriffs don't have to be certified law enforcement officers. So, and high bailiffs, I'm not as concerned with. But it would at least, yeah, I think it would be hard to set a qualification for. But I think, to go to Bob's point, if we're going to open up qualifications, and in the 21st century, all those jobs require qualifications, in my humble opinion, I would be open to considering expanding this to include all those we have yet to set qualifications for.
And you're talking specifically about the county officers.
State's attorneys and assistant judges, in addition to the sheriffs.
Right, and the probate judges,
Haven't been done. That's-
well, we would, if we want to make it
And we're trying,
consistent,
yeah.
we would add the language for the probate
Yes,
judges
yeah.
for removal,
For
if we
removal.
wanted to.
Yes, although you may want to keep them more like the rest of the judiciary as well.
But they don't go in front of judicial retention, probate
Well, they are
judges.
subject to the same disciplinary.
They are, but they are
processes.
not reviewed by us. They may be reviewed by the Supreme Court, but they are not, their performance is not reviewed by us.
But I will be in touch with the judiciary to get more clarity on what happens with probate judges, and if necessary, we can have them in to testify, so we can make sure we understand probate judges, and for that matter, assistant judges, because they do have some oversight over assistant judges for their judicial functions, I believe, but not for their executive functions. And assistant judges are just the weirdest job because they have both executive and judicial
Correct.
functions, which is a little
And
funky.
and they have no qualifications set forth. And it would behoove us to, I thank you, Bob, for, I think it, if we're gonna open this as an amendment, and amendments, as we know, take a lot of effort to get passed and a lot of energy to get through the legislature. And that might be a smart move.
It does open up the fact that if we do this route, we will have to hear from a lot more people. Because it wouldn't be just about sheriffs, we would have to hear from state's attorneys, and we would have to hear from, assistant judges, the judiciary, blah, 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 which is fine, we can certainly do that, but I just want to make sure that people understand it's a broader sort of swath of people we need to hear from.
So, I'm
Senator
sorry, go ahead.
Peelski.
Yes, and I, to Senator Norris's point, I think it does make sense to kind of look at the bigger picture of constitutional officers that are engaging with the public in this way. And now I'm back to process. We have the whole first biennium to pass this, correct? Like, we don't have to do it this year.
The whole biennium to do it, so it doesn't have to make crossover, in other words.
Okay, that was kind of what I was getting at,
Is that
because
I presume, crossover is Is an
Construct.
agreement, yes, is a construct, exactly, between the chambers, so you'd have to talk to,
Okay, I will talk with the secretary
Powers
and the
that
pro
be.
tem and see about that, but my understanding is no, it doesn't have to be crossovers. I think we did one of them after crossover last time, but I will check, because it's a new shop.
Yes, but having been through a couple of these, it's important for the Senate to get it done the first year.
Okay,
Yeah,
but if it doesn't have to, my concern is
Doesn't
if
have
we're
to be
expanding
crossover,
this to like, I lost count, but 5 or 6 other offices, and we have 5.5 weeks till crossover, like, there's no way.
Oh, yeah.
But if we have the whole year, I feel better about it.
yeah, I think we have the whole year, but I agree with Senator Clarkson, it's really important that we get it done the first
Okay.
year of the biennium.
Because
I
the
think
House
so
will
that
take-
then it will take a lot longer, because, yeah, their process is longer there.
even though they can't amend it?
Correct.
That seems strange, okay, anyways.
Maybe that's why
I
it
can't
takes
speak for them, but I would assume they would go through multiple committees. Senator Norris, did you have another question?
It's probably not the time to ask the question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So
Yeah, go for it.
what do you, after, just say this goes down the road and it passes and whatever else, what do you, who handles looking at the qualifications? What do you envision for which committee that goes through? Who's it?
Us.
So if and it would be in 5 years, basically, right? So it would probably, depending on which offices we end up having in that constitutional amendment, it would go through government operations, potentially judiciary committee. And yeah, probably GovOps and judiciary would be the 2 committees. And somebody would introduce a bill presumably, or there'd be a committee bill depending on whomever. If you and I are still here, we could do a bill together and
Oh,
introduce
the
it.
good
to-
Lord willing, yeah.
See how you feel after that.
And then we could, then it would just go through the process like anything else. Like we would have testimony from everybody and try to come up with what we think are the best qualifications for the
Well,
offices.
so just a little side story. Years ago, when I chaired a certain association, I spent 2 years trying to get qualifications for those particular.
I remember you saying that.
Yeah,
Which never went through, obviously, but I thought it was very important at the time, and I still think it's important.
yeah. And I think that, certainly we would talk with the Sheriff's Association and the state's attorneys and sheriff's department, and just like we are now, about what the qualifications are, or should be, or could be.
Recommendations, yeah.
Yeah, and then we'd have to pass it like a bill, like anything else, so there would be a rigorous process. Senator Watson.
Well, I just want to voice support for opening it up to looking at more than just the sheriffs. I mean, fair enough, maybe there's issues with some sheriffs right now, but that isn't to say that there could be other issues with other types of positions, like probate judges or whoever in the future. So I feel like in that way, it should take some pressure specifically off any one of those groups to say like, we're looking at the process generally. So.
One thing so this would be looking at basically all the county offices, if we did all the full slate,
County elected office.
the county elected offices. 2 things that I think we need to think about as we go through this process, more than 2, but 2 just off the top of my head is 1, we wouldn't be including state level elected officials, including ourselves as legislators, because there aren't qualifications. And so I think thinking about the differences between those offices is important, and whether, and what's the justification for it. And then the second thing is that the more complex the constitutional amendment is, the more public education and outreach there needs to be at the time when it's time to vote on it, and sort of, building the sort of case and public understanding of why we would be making this amendment. As we've just been through this process with 2 other amendments, so it's kind of a big push. And so thinking about making sure that we have a package that makes sense together, I think. And I think we could and would, but just thinking those. Senator Vygotsky.
It would be helpful for me thinking, because for me, this isn't about all the county offices so much as it is about like the way that those people interact with the public. Like I can't arrest someone. I can't put someone in jail. And so that feels fundamentally different to me than what some of these jobs can do. So it would be helpful to me and I am reluctant to admit this on the record, to have a clear understanding of what every one of these offices is in fact responsible for.
That's a great question. And is that something we can ask Tim to do for us, or like, you know,
But-
I
really?
think it depends. I think, you could ask, me speak for you for a minute, you could ask him to kind of go over what's in statute on the various offices, but if you want to know really what kind of the job, the day-to-day job entails, I think you should hear from representatives of those offices that work here.
Okay, well, maybe we would start next time, if we decide to go this route today, we could start with Tim walking through what they all do statutorily, and then we could hear from the Sheriff's Association, the State's Attorneys Association, I don't know if they all have associations, but
Yep,
whatever
they
the
do.
representative.
Even the high bailiffs.
Not by.
And I think the question for high bailiffs is, do we want to include them in this sort of pool, or are they even a necessary office? So that is a question, I think that's a fair question to
So-
ask.
I would say that if we do all the things we're thinking about, it, including in this amendment, their job would be redundant. They wouldn't,
Yes.
that the function that is set forth in the Constitution would no longer be needed.
There's no function set forth in the Constitution other than they get elected. Their functions exist in statute and.
Okay, thank you,
And do
thank you.
relate
So-
to what happens if the,
But their function is
Sheriff.
simply to remove the sheriff or to inform the sheriff, no, to
To be the sheriff.
to be the sheriff if the sheriff is,
If the sheriff is arrested.
right, that's what that is. But we have now deputy sheriffs, we now have other
So you
people
would
who are
like
also
one-
qualified.
you would likely want to include provisions if you're, looking at what happens with the sheriff and removal of a sheriff.
Right.
What happens if a sheriff if you get rid of the high bailiff position, what happens if the sheriff is fined or is removed?
Right, wait, Senator Watson.
So this is not exactly related to what we were talking about, but I want to make sure that I ask this question. So in the language that does exist here, the General Assembly may establish by law qualifications for the election to blah, blah. I just want to make sure that when we say qualifications for the election of, that includes the running of, in my mind, the election of is like. a
Election
date.
to and holding of.
Right, but I'm worried that somebody might run who is not qualified without, does that make sense?
Well,
That's
in
what
order to
can
get on
happen
the
now.
ballot, I mean, if you set qualifications in order to get on the ballot, the Secretary of State's office should be verifying that the
Sure.
candidate meets the qualifications.
Okay,
I don't know what that
so-
process looks like. but-
So by saying qualifications for the election
Election
to,
to and holding of.
then that includes even getting on the ballot.
So they don't get on the ballot.
Well,
they're
it
not
could,
qualified.
we could say hypothetically, you can be, to be elected to be sheriff, you have to be a resident of Vermont and whatever, and then to hold the office of sheriff, you have to be a certified law enforcement officer. So there could be a period where they could get their certification in order to hold the office. That's a possibility as well. And that was something actually Tim and I talked about as a possibility, and then I think
Yeah.
you told me, no, you can't do that.
Yes, that's a
With the
good
high
idea.
bailiff, if the high bailiff were to take over for the sheriff for more than 30 days, could we require them to be a certified law enforcement office?
Yeah, we
But we
could.
could,
Right.
but we couldn't under current law.
Yeah, I could picture a scenario where somebody's waiting to get their certification, they've taken the training or they one more to do or something like that. And they would like to be on the ballot and would they be prevented potentially from getting on the ballot if their certification hadn't come through yet, but it was gonna come through like any day? you know, like that
Right,
kind of
exactly.
thing.
Or like passing the bar to be.
Right.
I think it would depend on how you actually wrote the qualification statutes.
Okay.
So you may have different, as the chair said, you may have different qualifications for being elected and then, and holding.
Okay,
If you wanted to allow for that kind of possibility, or you may want somebody who
okay.
has
Okay,
had,
that makes me feel a lot
has had
better.
certification for.
It depends on how
a period
seasoned
of
you want
time.
that law enforcement officer to be, if they're gonna be the sheriff of a county. So, a
Senator
newly
Norris.
trained person.
Just a quick question. So is it the committee's intent to look at Prop 1 along with the qualifications and or removal of the sheriff, would the intent be to eliminate the impeachment process?
I think if we, I defer to Jen maybe, but if we included the provision about removal, then I think that would supersede the impeachment process that we.
I'm not sure it would supersede. I think you would still have the ability, I mean, depending on what the removal process was, if whoever was in charge of the removal process didn't remove, I'm not sure you want to limit your authorities. The legislature
It would give us
to remove. It
two
might give you a
options.
separate
Okay,
option.
yeah.
Have
I
to
think
think
it
about
would give
whether
us two
there, yeah, I have to think about whether there are any reasons that wouldn't work, but.
Okay. So it could potentially be both. But obviously, we're just starting to talk about this, so there'll be more we'll have to hear about and think about and before we get there. Senator Clarkson.
Well, I think for the sheriff who has just arrived, we'll bring you up to speed. We're looking at expanding this to consider the other statutory and the other constitutional officers if we're going to look at qualifications.
Well, I think that he can watch the tape if he wants to.
Oh, yes. Oh, he's here. So it just.
Are there other questions for Jen while she's here, or other things we'd like her to maybe do research on and suggest somebody we should hear from? Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Hardy. How often do we do constitutional amendments just in general? Like, is it, because I really do respect the point you're making, Senator Norris, around, we don't want to just open the Constitution up willy-nilly, but it does feel like we have had something just about every 4 years. We have.
I'm not sure that things have gone on the, have actually made it to the voters that often. Constitutional amendments are proposed pretty much every time the time lock opens. And it used to be a 10-year time lock, so then there was a lot pent up by the time it was actually right for addressing. But the Secretary of State's office actually has some great information on past constitutional amendment proposals, and many of them say, referred to the Committee on Government Operations never emerged. So there are a lot that are proposed, but few that make it all the way through.
And how often, do we line up with other states in that regard? I mean, are we an outlier in
That
how
I
often?
do not
or-
know.
That's
I
kind
think-
of, yeah.
I think there are a variety of processes and timing for how often the Constitution can be amended. So I don't know that we can look at what the timeline.
It was just kind of an interesting.
We can certainly, I think there's information, but my recollection from the last time when we had floor reports on this, I remember the former chair of this committee talking about how Vermont has one of the most difficult
It does.
constitutional
It
amendment
does.
processes in the country.
Oh,
There are other states that you can just do a ballot initiative and
Yeah.
voters can get a constitutional
Good
amendment.
point.
That happened just now, I think, in Michigan. And that it's easier to do it that way. And there are other states that you can do it just every session. And there's less of a multiple vote processes. So I think that information, your office might have it somewhere.
Yeah, that's a good
It's
point.
kind of an interesting.
And so
Yes, it has.
my recollection is that it's harder in Vermont than in other states. And prior to the ones that we just did in 2022, the one previous to that was in 2010.
Yeah.
And that was the one about allowing 17-year-olds to vote in a primary if they would turn 18 by election day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an easy and often thing, but it is a thing we can do, especially because we're the Senate, so that's where it starts.
We failed to pass the Equal Rights.
Yeah, so there's a lot of history that we can certainly get somebody in here
Time
to
to-
wax eloquently about if we want, I'm sure.
I'm sure we can find a story.
Yeah, Senator Yosti.
Well, and even the two proposed amendments that we did pass in the last biennium sort of point to some that didn't make it out, given that they were numbered 2 and 5. And so I'm assuming at least 1, 3, and 4 didn't make it through the process.
I think we had 6 or 7.
Yeah, we had multiples. There's usually one about length of terms for the governor, the constitutional officers. And sometimes it includes the Senate and sometimes it doesn't. And so, yeah, there's some that come up pretty much every time, but so far this is the only one this session. But
There were 9 last session.
Okay.
Or 2 years, I mean.
4 years ago,
Yes.
yeah.
last
All
time.
right, are there,
One quick question.
yeah, go ahead, Senator Norris.
And it shouldn't be an easy process, I might add. Who sets, or how are the term limits set as far as starting and ending dates for, in this particular case, we'll say sheriff?
Oh, yeah, those are constitutional.
Yeah, they are constitutional.
It's another thing to consider if you think they should be changed, if we think they should be changed.
I can tell you why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, go for it. Why are you asking the question?
When my term ended on January 31st, 2019, I was informed by the retirement board that I would not get a COLA increase because you have to be retired 12 consecutive months. I said, well, so come next February 1, no, it's 12 consecutive months within the same calendar year.
Oh.
So I waited 23 months to get a COLA increase of God knows what it was at the time. I'm going, but I don't set the terms. I mean, it's like,
I would suggest if you want to address that problem, you do it by addressing the retirement statutes
okay.
and not go through the constitution.
Yeah. No, that's why I was asking who sets the term, the starting and ending date.
So the starting and ending dates of the terms are set in the Constitution, but the determination of when COLAs apply and you know, how long you have to have been retired for, I think
23
would be
consecutive months.
within the purview of either the statutes or that we could change, or the treasurer's office.
I'm not gonna, I mean, I've already done my time, so to speak, so it's not.
Bob, you have that opportunity to put it in a drafting request.
Yeah,
That's true. You have no the Senate has no deadlines for draft requests the first year.
Not this year.
yeah. Okay, other questions for Jen? So do we, a couple little things we wanted you to look into?
You did.
Okay.
Some of them I think you're still thinking about, but whether you want to expand to all of potentially to all of the elected constitutional county offices. You're also thinking about whether you want to keep the high bailiff position. I'm looking at whether there's any issue with having both removal authority and impeachment authority coexist. How often other states amend or propose amendments to their constitutions. And then I think we're also trying to understand a little bit more about the probate judge judiciary process.
Okay, and I will check in with the judiciary on that one. And I mean, if you want to also, but I can do that.
Who reviews their performance?
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
talk with
'cause I
Judge
think that's
Stoney
a
about
good-
that.
Well, how do they get, you know,
Remove
how do
it.
they get removed?
Yeah, and
Is it just
then,
impeachment?
what, so do we want to have Jen redraft something, or are we ready to make the decision about having a redraft? So we can always change our mind and not do it, but, do we want to look at another draft that includes all of them?
I would say yes, and I would include the language you already read to us about the.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll do that for all of them. So we would be looking at doing that for assistant judges, sheriffs, states, attorneys, and potentially probate judges.
Mhm.
And that would just be adding that additional
That would just be
language.
adding
on
the
removal.
removal piece.
Yep.
Okay,
And then what,
And-
do we want to make a choice about high bailiff, or do we want to wait and mull that?
I'd include the high bailiff for the moment.
so what that would look like would be amending a different section of the Constitution, which we can totally do to just, I think, strike them. And then separately, you would want to potentially address them in either address them in the statutes or have some way that they are selected other than through as constitutional officers.
Senator Watson, you're looking skeptical.
Less, so I guess I'm less interested in potentially doing away with the high bailiff, even though that might be a legitimate thing to do. The other reason is, just thinking about like when you put a lot of things in a chain, especially, you know, thinking about your point about the education that would be necessary. I would hate for there to be some high bailiff that is like, my job is important and you should not vote for this.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And that it is in a certain sense like a separate question or issue.
Mhm.
And so
We could do a separate,
I kind of feel like that might be a separate, like, because if this proposal is about the removal, discipline, and election of county-wide offices, and let's just keep it to that
Mhm.
and consider high bailiff separately.
Okay, Senator White, did you have? Senator Clarkson?
So I would counter with that. I would feel very uncomfortable having somebody with no qualifications stepping in to fill the post of somebody who does have qualifications. So I would feel very uncomfortable if we did not also amend high bailiff
Oh,
to
That's
be, I'm sorry, if we're gonna go to the effort of setting qualifications for one job and have another job that steps in, I would not feel comfortable with that inequity of qualification.
Well, my understanding about, and Jen, I think said this, but the high bailiff, there's nothing in the Constitution, but except for the mention of the high bailiff, the duties of the high bailiff are in statute, so we could change the statute. on
Well,
high
you still have the
bailiffs.
qualifications issue, because the qualification for that office, just like the qualification for sheriff, is to basically be a voter in the state of Vermont.
Right, but
So you could put similar language, like you could put these, 3 sentences in
I would just include it.
for high bailiffs, if you wanted to create that as sort of another position for which you would also have the authority.
Because then you'd be setting qualification requirement. It's, the amendment is really about setting qualification requirements and reasons to remove.
But the Constitution doesn't say what a high bailiff is supposed to do.
Right.
So if we don't say it in statute, then do they have any duties?
They have the duties that you've given them in, so they have the duties you've given them in statute.
Right.
The Constitution doesn't address their duties at all.
So we could change their duties in statute or just remove all the duties and then they don't do anything.
They just existed.
Just like,
Yeah,
isn't
so
there
it would be
another-
odd to have I think it would be odd to have a constitutional officer with no duties.
Isn't there one in there though, Tim? Don't you remember? Didn't we talk about this? There's something in the Constitution that has no duties.
I don't recall what is that. There might be.
And it's not the high bailiff, that's what we're
No,
talking
that's
about
what
right
we're
That's
now.
what we're talking
Something
about.
else. Okay, why don't we hold off on the high bailiff question for now, since we're obviously not at consensus, but we'll move along with the other ones.
Okay.
And mirror the language for all of them, and we'll get back to this. Well, let's mull the high bailiff. Thank you, Jen.
That sounds like pickling.
The
No, well.
adjutant general
high
could do
bailiff.
that.
put them in one.
Pickled high
Serve a high bailiff. for
Okay,
once.
this got real weird. Now we're on saying weird things. Okay,
It's a wonderful
we
moment.
are moving right along to our next witness. Mark, you want to join us at the table, Sheriff Anderson? And now we're talking about both S17, the bill, and Prop 1, to the extent that you want to address that. We've obviously just made a decision to change it pretty radically. So it's up to you. You tell us what you want us to hear.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Introduce yourself first.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Senate Committee on Government Operations. For the record, my name is Mark Anderson. I'm the Wyndham County Sheriff, and I am the president of the Vermont Sheriff's Association. I think it is important for me, I'm going to share a statement that Senator Norris has made. I'm here to defend the institution of sheriff, not the actions of sheriffs. I also think it's important that I qualify. I'm a member of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, which means that any conduct that comes before the council, that I would have a vote on whether to certify or remain with a certification, to decertify, to take some form of professional regulation action. And so without having been presented any evidence in a factual case, I don't want to make a statement about any specific individual on the basis of I don't want to have to recuse myself for a purpose of bias. So that said, we've read the news, we know that there are issues and issues that need to be addressed with due process through the proper channels. We have the professional regulation function of the Criminal Justice Council, for which I suspect several of the cases that we have discussed are certainly being dealt with. There's also due process through the criminal courts, and those are, again, things that are ongoing. So I come here with the position that the Sheriff's Association opposes S17 is currently written. That's not a change from what we previously have testified to. It's not an opposition of reform. In fact, the Sheriff's Association wants to join you in the work on reforms with sheriffs. We don't want to be sitting here defending bad actors. How do we get there? I don't know. And I think some of the open ideas, we recognize that the Constitution is a sacred document that requires a significant process to change. We recognize that statutes are far more malleable to change. And one of the, I think one of the issues that the sheriffs want to take as we discuss reforms is how do we effectuate change quickly? I'm going to speak to Prop 1 first because I think that's the easiest one. We have no position on Prop 1. The reason we have no position is because as of yesterday, we have an entirely new sheriff's association, and so we haven't had a chance to meet yet. I don't know what direction my association will go, and I'm here to represent their interests. It sounds like you've already discussed the one point I would make, just as an opportunity to mention it, which is if we're going to talk about one specific office, then we should probably talk about all of the offices. I mentioned the role of state's attorney, simply not to call out the state's attorneys, but as a point of concern. If I were to run as state's attorney and I am not a licensed attorney, I am not admitted to the bar, my understanding is that I could be elected to be the state's attorney. And it's also my understanding that a non-attorney cannot supervise an attorney, which then makes me wonder, did I just break the criminal justice system in that county?
Correct.
So there's these nuances, these awkward positions for which it just seems that the effort to pass a constitutional amendment is pursued, and we're talking about what qualifications an elected official requires. We should do it in one fell swoop. I overheard discussion about the desire to potentially eliminate the high bailiff. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we didn't come to a conclusion on it, but we chatted about it.
So I will mention, I was personally a high bailiff at one point. I was one of the few high bailiffs that also have to execute the office of high bailiff because the sheriff at the time had stepped down, he retired. And so I did fulfill that role for approximately 11 days until the governor made an appointment, which was ultimately myself. At the time, I was also the second in command of the department. If we talk about succession of an agency, and that's really, I think, the important thing. We want stability of departments. Two things have happened over time. We generally identify people as the second in command of an agency that are capable of that. And so if the high bailiff is outside of the department, which happens frequently, usually they know who the second in command is. They have a relationship there because they don't want to screw up the sheriff's department any more than the sheriff wants to screw up the sheriff's department. So with that, if we look to analogous organizations, police departments, or the variety of different things, education, superintendents, usually it's someone from within a system or someone with requisite knowledge of how that organization works that would succeed. The concern I have with a high bailiff is being that it could literally be someone who has no experience or could also be decertified. So if we're talking about certification for a sheriff's requirement, we might want to consider certification for a high bailiff. I can also say our experience from the Sheriff's Association's perspective is that when we see people come from outside of a sheriff's office, they're not used to the funding constraints that sheriff's offices generally face, which is that a majority of the work we do is contractual. It's not raised by taxes. So there's often, we call it the 1 year learning curve. There's often the 1 year learning curve for which sheriffs need to understand that their budget cycles have to coincide with the organizations they work with. And so I know I have budget season in February, I have budget season in November. And then somewhere along the lines, I also have my own regular contractual changes that occur. And for my organization, that's July. So there's a lot going on in that 1 year, and there's a lot of tough lessons that one can learn, not realizing the knowledge that they don't know. So with regards to the high bailiff, I think it would be important to ensure we have competent, qualified people who can be the successor, whether that requires elevation from within an organization or elevation from outside the organization, especially if we've identified a rotten bunch of apples as opposed to one. So Prop 1, I think, is pretty easy. We don't necessarily want the constitutional amendment, but we're okay with it if it means we actually get reform. The reason we probably don't want it is simply because the time to make the change, if it can be effectuated through statutory change. However, we think with S17, there's opportunities for reforms. So if we can effectuate the change, I think that's where we land traction to create true reforms that ultimately create opportunity for improvement of the current systems, continues to fill the gaps that sheriffs currently serve without disrupting any of the organizations we support or the services we provide for monitors.
I'm going to stop you there because what you did miss before you came in the room was our legal counsel basically saying that most of the things that we might want to consider or may consider for reform are not possible without a constitutional change.
So
So
That's,
we're sort of stuck in the, what narrow thing can we do in the short term? And what then moving forward with the constitutional amendment and then looking at the long term for reform?
and I don't think the sheriffs would, I don't want to submit that we're oppositional to the constitutional change. I want to say that the preference would be the statutory change where possible. And so if it's not possible, again, not a position, but we're in this to create the improvements that are necessary.
And we certainly can talk about statutory changes and run them by our legal counsel and say, could we do this?
Sure.
Which is what Tim and I have been doing for a couple months now. And I'm certainly, the more the merrier in that respect. So I know that you had some suggestions you sent me. And as I told you before, I ran them through legislative council. And they said pretty much this is most likely a no-go. But particularly within the sort of financial realm, I think there are things that we can do. The auditor's office had some suggestions. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the suggestions that they made or others that you would suggest that would be within the auditor's office. Have you seen those, Tim?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. We will.
Did any of us?
Yes, they testified.
Oh,
and
when the auditors
suggested
test, right.
The auditor had
Yeah.
actual, like, as you might imagine from a former
Yes.
senator.
Exact language for us.
Exact language changes.
Right.
Yeah, it should be on the website under Tim Ash's name, so. But anyway, go ahead, Sheriff, and let us know what you think of those or other suggestions that we could look into.
Sure. So with regards to the auditor's comments, again, the Sheriff's Association has no position simply because we haven't been able to meet since then.
Okay.
I would like to come back with a formal position, but I think I can speak rather broadly and efficiently to it. I think for the most part, most of the language, I don't think we'd have any issue with. Generally, our relationship with the auditor's office is if they identify something, we want to clean that something up. And so if they say, I get audited regularly, if my auditor identifies that I failed to sign one invoice, just one, well, they'll identify that there was a potential for a failure of an internal control. So what are we going to do? We're going to address that because I don't want that to show up because it reflects on me as an administrator. So generally speaking, I don't think that the auditor's changes would require too much massaging from the sheriffs. But without the language directly in front of me, I wasn't prepared to speak to that today.
Okay, that's fine.
We actually appreciate the auditor's support of, especially with some of the discussions that have been going on. And we'll note that the Uniform Manual for Accounting for Sheriffs, generally, we want to see support of that and we want to follow that. I believe we are required to follow that. And I say I believe because I had a conversation with the auditor in which I need to get clarification when she said it's a guideline. And I'm on the understanding that it's not a guideline, we must follow it. So that was a bit of a confusion for me and I will follow up with them. I'm not sure that needs your bandwidth. With regards to S17, there's discussion around the 5%. I think it opens a broader conversation about how sheriffs are compensated and the lack of parity that sheriffs have with regards to other state law enforcement agencies or officers. There's frustration from my colleagues in that entry-level dispatchers are making higher wages than we are. Retirements, our retirement is set based off of the statutory salary. So to that end, my retirement, if I were to qualify for retirement right now, it would be roughly half the retirement that other state employees get. And we do have materials that we can submit if you'd like to see that just as comparison. But in short, I'd be looking to retire somewhere around $40,000. So I'm probably looking for another job after I retire as being sheriff, simply because it's not cheap to live here.
You can become a legislator.
I hear you guys are paid fairly similar.
You might be paid better than we are.
It's a real lucrative path. I mean, just ask your colleagues.
Yeah.
It would be great to have some suggestion, some proposals in writing, and specifically for the compensation issues, proposals in writing about that for us to really think about. We haven't dug into the compensation of sheriffs or even frankly, and I hear you that this is part of the problem, the way that sheriff offices are funded, because they're in our quirky county government system, which is not well funded. So if you have suggestions for that for us to consider, that would be helpful. Just and even language that we might consider. Making no promises that we would like it, but that we could look at it.
Sure. I do know, I believe it was in House Government Operations, it could have been Judiciary. Justice Reiber mentioned that maybe requiring sheriffs to provide security at the courthouses and make that a responsibility of the sheriffs. Broadly, it is an application we primarily support. Often the issue that we ran into historically is that the cost to provide the security was higher than the reimbursement. So in short, it was the contract work that the sheriff provides that subsidized the state of Vermont for the security of the courthouses that the state wants the security in. So I think that there's ways, again, I'm not here to advocate or not advocate for, but when the sheriffs who go to the judiciary to say this is what our costs will be, and then the judiciary needs to advocate on our behalf for what those costs are, and then it's turned down for whatever reason it is, then we're still left in this position of how do we fund these positions, or how do we cover these positions, equip them, train.
Senator White?
Thank you, Chair Hardy. So my question to you then is, but you're saying that you are favorable to having it be in statute or be something that you would be required to do, because the argument is you'd be able to better advocate for the pay. I worry the opposite is true, that you would there would be no negotiation. Or am I confused?
This is about courthouse
Yes.
security.
You're saying that you're okay to having that be a part of the bill as a requirement of sheriffs.
I can only speak to my personal preference as the Lincoln
Okay.
County Sheriff, which is I would prefer to be able to tell the legislature, I need 4.5 people and not a half body, but a part-time position at the Brattleboro Courthouse for these reasons and lay out the reasons. And if I was told, we're only giving you funding for 3, your argument's weak, then so be it. But if my argument results in the closure of a courtroom, there's clear discussion and dialogue between me, the legislature, and the judiciary to say, well, we talked about this beforehand and there was a decision made.
Okay, I understand now. So this,
However, the conversation about the legislature requiring the courts and the sheriffs to get into a contract about courthouses is probably moot because, and I'm looking at our council because we discussed this, and I don't think we can require this judiciary to enter into a contract with the sheriffs, that it's beyond, it's a separation of powers issue. Tim, do you want to?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, that's what Senator Sears and I looked into this as a possibility, and I think it was given the no.
I'll make an extension of that, which could be it could be state properties, part of the administration's properties, which we also provide security for DCF when there's threats against workers and a variety of other organizations.
Well, we can certainly look into the possibility of state contracts and how you're paid for those state contracts. But
However, our courthouses are not owned by the state, they're owned by our county.
Oh, yeah.
So just it goes a little circular.
Just saying.
The separation of powers is a problem because we also run the judiciary's budget. So this is a budgetary issue in large measure. And so it's a little bit of gray area, quite honestly. I mean, you know, in terms of, anyway. I would think we could figure out a path forward
judiciary about it.
Yeah, I
It
think
was,
that's a good idea.
I think it's something that has been discussed multiple times in judiciary, and they've kind of hit a wall with it, and so, but I
We could figure
will,
it out.
I will do a little more digging and asking about that, and I think we would have to have the judiciary in to talk about it. There are other things you want us to know at this point. You brought up the 5%, so I would just, you know, and I've told you this in another avenue, but I think that it's, given the issues we've seen with financial management of sheriff's offices, parameters around that 5% at the very least are really necessary. And so if you could come back to us with a proposal about what parameters you think would be helpful and reasonable, I think that would be helpful. As we've discussed, there's no other place in statute that allows an office to charge this 5% and then directly enhance their own salary for it. You know, the state's attorney or the governor or the whatever, nobody can do that. Except for sheriffs, and I understand that there's sort of history behind why that came about, but it's clearly used in a variety of different ways, depending on the sheriff's discretion. And so how can we allow sheriffs to charge an overhead or administrative fee for their contracts without it being abused or used in a way that may not be as ethical? So.
And so there's been discussion about, I believe you've heard testimony, but forgive me if you haven't, about what the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs are.
Yes.
So broadly, they're the organization that represents 28 different people's budgets by one discussion. So through that, sheriff's offices generally receive little support, and this isn't a criticism of the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs. They just don't really have the resources to provide some form of administrative assistance, which could be, say, making up a title, if you will, but a director of sheriffs who could help develop a code of conduct or code of ethics, who could help develop policies, even if they're just model policies. But if there's a model policy for bonuses, because I know that has come up as an issue, if there's a model policy for bonuses, it's easier for me to say, okay, I've received this, my Department of Legal Counsel's reviewed it, and we're good with it. There's the policy. So having somebody who's has the bandwidth to help create these things, I think would be very valuable to us, and adding that type of a position or asset to the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs would potentially help pave the way for professionalizing some of the departments that walk in, they have a practice, the auditor reviews their department every 2 years, nothing's ever identified, and therefore they assume they're doing something that's okay. But the auditor doesn't look under every stone, they look at a percentage of all the stones. So to that end, 20% of the documents are reviewed, or 10%, I'm not sure what the percentage is, then ultimately it may or may not be identified in a timely manner. So having that type of resource would be beneficial. In terms of guardrails around the 5%, I'm sure I've said this before, I'm gonna repeat it. Sheriffs are also unique in state government in that we generally don't receive funding for equipment, uniforms, training, all the things. And so with that, we're also this unique animal where nowhere else is just really self-funded, for lack of better terms. And so the 5%, I'm not here to defend the 5% itself, but rather to say this is really broadly a compensation discussion. And if we're going to look to preserve the 5%, I mean, one guardrail could be it can't exceed a salary of a like position in state government. So, I mean, that could be one way of saying this won't be abused if the perception is how the funds are being used. There's also the ability for the Department of Human Resources, if the legislature is able to compel, to do an analysis. I mean, human resources analysis is a common study skill. There's a science behind compensation and how that's done. One of the things we're here to talk about is how do we professionalize sheriffs? Well, I don't know of any human resource theory or compensation theory really that says cut the pay and that will make them better. So to that point, when we talk about the 5%, it is a compensation to the sheriff, whether it's liked or not liked is somewhat unrelated to how do we ensure the sheriff is fairly compensated and why are we seeing sheriffs fall behind entry-level dispatchers, entry-level troopers, entry-level supervisors, entry-level managers, and managers and command staff of various state agencies, but we're saying we want to do better. We can recruit with better salaries. We can bring in more qualified sheriffs with better salaries.
All right, well, thank you. Senator Clarkson?
So Mark, you haven't done, or the Sheriff's Association hasn't done a cost analysis of what it would cost if state took, actually paid you all, just made you all state employees or even county employees, but I mean, just what it would cost for the public to take on. I mean, the public takes it on just in different buckets, but if the public took it on in a more transparent, straightforward, single system way, like either in the county budget or in the state budget, do we have a cost analysis of what adding the sheriffs with their current staff would cost and add to either the county or the state budget?
So the only thing we've developed is the cost of the sheriff. We do have that data. It's actually public record. Most sheriffs' total compensation is roughly, this is including all benefits, healthcare, retirement, total compensation somewhere around $140,000. We do have a lower and an upper, and some of that's just based on when the
average is 140.
Well, let's call it 140 for the sake, and I'll submit records with what it actually is. The base wage is, I think, right now $94,000 a year. And then the 5% would be added on top of that for any of the administrative work that the sheriff does for the contracts. To bring the entire departments in, we have not done that work. There's disparities across all 14 counties in terms of who gets benefits or who doesn't get benefits, or some counties just still don't provide retirement or healthcare because their contracts can't support them.
So, okay.
So
I guess I was confused by your request of the Human Resources Department. Is that something you guys could undertake doing that just with the current staffing, independent of how it's compensated at the moment, but just looking at the current staffing and some base benefits, just the benefits of the best practices. And I mean, because I think for us to look at some of this, we also have to understand the cost implication of what we're sidestepping. I mean, what we have sidestepped.
So the reason I suggest Department of Human Resources is for the purpose of transparency and I suppose trust, because they are experts in the field of wage analysis and compensation. Submit to them what is the guardrail. I could articulate a variety of different guardrails, but I'm not sure that the guardrails coming directly from me is also a fair way to do that.
That would be great. I would be very supportive.
Well,
of
we can talk to HR about the possibility of looking at doing some compensation study or something, or we could find out if we ask them to do it, what their reaction might be.
But there, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's an interesting, you mentioned different buckets and you just made me think of this. I mean, right now, just my town contracts, they come from the towns in the county. So to eliminate a contract entirely and say the county can pay for a police force, which is currently prohibited under Stowe v. Lamoille, a Supreme Court case from 1976, I believe. I mean, to change that would then mean I could deliver that resource to the towns. And then I don't need to say, well, how do I buy a car?
Right. And it gets to our regional public safety issues, which
Well,
some of us.
So I think, one question that the bill contemplates, and I know that you have kind of are a little uncomfortable with this provision, but it contemplates, do we need 14 sheriffs? Right now, we have one for each county, and the counties are of varying sizes. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says how many sheriffs we need to have, nor what their districts need to be. They've just grown up as part of the counties. And so I think another fair question to ask is if we're looking at compensation and the sort of cost of providing sheriff services in the state, is the question of, do we need 14 sheriffs? And is the county way of distributing sheriffs, i.e. their districts from which they're voted on, is that the most effective and efficient? Is that what's the magic number of that, just because we have 14 counties?
So as you already stated, I have some discomfort for, I think, a simple reason. My experience as sheriff is that people from the community want to identify with me. It's unique in the context that we're the only law enforcement officer, aside from the state's attorney, but we're the law enforcement officer, I guess, interacting with the crisis that they pick. They don't get to pick their police chief. They don't get to pick their station commander, lieutenant from the state police. They get to pick us. And so while there are some issues where there may be question of if the people knowingly picked the sheriff that they picked, I can't speak to that. We have a lot of people who identify, but I will also acknowledge in the same regard of history, counties are arbitrary. I mean, it is a line that was drawn through a fight with a guy from New York and a guy from New Hampshire, and so are the 9 square mile towns that we have. And like, there's some arbitrary lines that were drawn by people 300 years ago. So I think for the sake of identity, people generally know what county they belong to. I also know through several conversations today and yesterday and with Madam Chair about people's passion to the district they're represented by. I think that I think that to have large counties, let's pretend we drew this for districts. If we may have large districts, might be even harder to deliver services. In some regards, I could say we could add, in my county, we could probably add 3 counties because there's 3 identities in Windham County, and they generally follow the watersheds. But then coming back to cost, well, to add 2 more sheriffs to Windham County now means we need to come up with the salaries, which then where does that come from and how do we make it work? So,
right. So what's the most efficient and effective way of delivering sheriff services throughout the state? Especially if we're talking about potentially raising the compensation of sheriffs, raising the compensation for 14 individuals, it's more difficult than for 7 individuals. Sure. Or however much we decide. But so we actually have to move on to our next witness, who I believe is she on? She's coming in person?
Or unless you're
VLCT, who is it from Gwen? Is Gwen Zakoff out there?
She might be in transportation.
If not, you can keep talking, but if she's there, then we don't see her. Okay.
She may be in transportation, which is where she often hangs out until she's ready.
Yeah, you don't have to do that, Jen. I can send
me.
you can send a senator to do it.
Sometimes it's more valuable.
Exactly.
I didn't say it.
Well, it would be great if,
She was watching, she was just coming out.
oh, okay, great, okay, thank you. Well, just before you leave, Mark, just, it would be great if next time, and I don't know if it'll be next week or the week after, if you could come back with specific language. And specific, I know that you guys just reformed yesterday, so I get why you couldn't do it today. But specific language suggestions, if you could look at the suggestions from the auditor's office, think about the parameters on the 5% and make a proposal. And if you could think about the sort of number of sheriff's issues. I understand you might not love it, but that would be helpful. And if you could, maybe you and I could talk beforehand, and if you could send it to me, that would be great. So we can sort of get into the nuts and bolts next time. Because as you know, the clock is ticking. So, all right, thank you,
Thank you.
Sheriff Anderson. Pleasure as always.
Very done.
Thank you. We weren't sure where you were.
I was next door, just right over there.
So were you watching us?
Just the last 10 minutes.
Okay, so we had a long discussion about the constitutional amendment and have made some decisions about making modifications to that. And I'm going to tell you what those are because they're definitely relevant to you. But and then we're talking more broadly on S17, the legislation. So without going into the depths of a constitutional amendment process, which I think you probably are a little familiar with, we are now contemplating changes that would that would add the line about qualifications, but also removal process for sheriffs and state's attorneys, assistant judges, and probate judges, right? Yeah. So those 4 county offices, we're still mulling what, if anything, we would want to do for high bailiffs. So that's where we're at right now. So I don't know if you want to add anything about that, but that complicates things, but also simplifies things at the same time. But so, go ahead and you've met all of us, so we'll just cut to the chase and you can introduce yourself again and then tell us what you want to do.
Gwen Zacka, Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Yeah, so this conversation has evolved over the last week and a half since we were asked to testify. So I think I heard Roger Marcoux and asked that the league testify, and more I was reading over the Prop 1 and 17, sort of realizing that we're not the experts in this field. We represent towns and cities, but the messaging, we wanted to convey to the committee is that the number of towns and cities in the state that are growing police agencies is 0. The state is losing municipal agencies. I wouldn't say year after year, but on a relatively continual basis. Right now, if you look on the Criminal Justice Council website, they have a list of all the agencies. There are 54 municipal agencies at current counts. There was 56 just a few years ago. It might be down to 52. We're not really sure about the status of Canaan and Brighton right now, very small agencies. And you see a good instance I like to bring up is that, in the town of Waterbury several years back, they had dissolved their village, and before they had dissolved that, they had gotten rid of their law enforcement agency, which was attached to their village. And I remember having conversations with the then town manager about sort of the cost of what it costs to run even a small agency that wasn't even a full 24/7 agency with, I think, 4.5 staff folks. It was at that point $500,000 right there just to run that small agency. So I think that paints a pretty good picture of figuring out where, if you're looking to municipalities to fill the role of growing law enforcement, you're barking up the wrong tree. There just isn't the capacity. So that leads us to talking about the role that sheriffs play, which is, in our opinion, going to grow over time. And with that growth, because there's obviously a reliance on them in many corners of the state, particularly those areas where communities are far from other municipal agencies or far from police barracks. The reliance on the county sheriffs is relatively high. I guess you can say if you've seen one sheriff's agency, you've seen one sheriff's agency. They're all a little bit different, but there is definitely a reliance at the town and city level, just as much as the state has a reliance on them. And I know you've been learning a little bit about that. And so I don't have an answer to the question about how the professionalization sort of is elevated for the sheriffs. I think the messaging we wanted to convey is that if towns and cities in our communities are relying on the county sheriffs to provide good law enforcement to their communities, that there is that accountability, that there are some checks and balances and some level of parity to sort of the way that towns, cities, and the states can have control over their agency heads. So that's a conundrum I don't know how to solve. But I think just the messaging that if our communities are asking more of our law enforcement to represent their communities better, you know, if the state is going through this whole process of changing the way sheriffs or agencies are run, make them better, make them more accountable.
That's our
And,
goal.
Yeah. So so that's where we wanted to go with that. I didn't necessarily prepare to talk about the other 4 county offices. I think there's less of a connection there to the town, maybe the side judges making their county budgets, but I'd have to think a little bit more about that. But it's interesting to see that, you know, we have a lot of questions at the local level, whether they're coming from the public or coming from other individuals and at the town level when, you know, they're unhappy with a select board member or unhappy with the mayor or whoever. And, you know, most towns under general statute, there is no recall provision. There is no recall provision. We tried to get a recall provision in S181 last year, it didn't go by. But there's some towns that have charters that do allow for recall of, you know, if 30% of voters petition for or whatnot. But the answer is always wait until the next election cycle. So, and this is a sticky issue at the local level as well. So we feel that pain to a certain degree, but I think usually the seats at the local level are 2 to 3 years and not 4 years. So a little bit closer to maybe.
Well, I think you make a good point about, if towns are relying more and more on sheriff services, but you have no control over the quality or reliability of those services. That is obviously frustrating, to say the least, and problematic from a perspective of providing and protecting the public safety. As the whole discussion earlier is that unfortunately we can't really do much under the current constitutional constraints. But I think the goal would be to change the Constitution so that we could then put more qualifications for holding the office, more sort of parameters around the quality of the services probably, and then how an easier way to remove them if they're not doing their job. So unfortunately, that is 5 years down the road. But I don't know if there are things that we did talk a little bit more about. I think we could do some more about financial management of offices at this point. But if there are other things that you have to suggest, we can certainly run it by legal counsel and see if we can do it.
I mean, I'm more familiar about I shouldn't say more familiar. I mean, I understand that towns are contracting out for certain services and they create the terms of those contracts. And again, every contract's going to be a little bit different, and whether you like them or not, those contracts are based off of 2 parties signing in, one saying this is what we're able to provide or willing to provide, and the other saying this is what we're demanding. So they look really different based off of each county and each community. So that becomes, I wouldn't say an issue, but there's a lot of flexibility in that. And so any changes to that, there might be, it could get a little tricky at the local level to sort of sell it to the voters if they're not able to control sort of terms of those contracts.
I don't think that we would change that. And actually, that's a really good point, is that's the way you can right now control quality and is through contracting provisions. But if you have a sheriff who's not executing their duties well, then there's only so much you can do. Senator Clarkson.
Thanks. This goes really to the heart of an issue this committee has been dedicated to for the last 6 years, which is long-term looking at regional delivery of public safety services. And Mark's been involved in that, Gwen's been involved with that. This is a big discussion we've had with EMS, fire, and sheriffs and police. And quite honestly, it's also an equity issue because not all towns can afford and or are willing. And there's this bad blood between the towns that rely on state police services, which they think are free. Of course, we're all paying for those. And those that contract and there is not a guarantee of quality if you contract for, anyway, there are no guarantees on quality. But this, to me, I think goes hand in glove with what we could be considering, because if we beef up the qualifications for the sheriff, if we instill more trust in this office, if we build out a robust sheriff system, we could consider regionalization of our public safety network in a way that where all towns would have equal access. They'd all pay, they'd all participate, and there would be more equity of service delivery, which is one thing I'm hoping that will come out of some of this conversation. Because we right now have real inequities on public safety. We're suffering not only from the lack of volunteers to our fire and EMS departments, but we're suffering, anyway, the whole range, we've heard it now, on all three branches of our public safety delivery system. And so how do we, in an equitable way, deliver regional safety? And I think that's the big question we need to keep in the back of our minds. And all these pieces I think, help improve it. Qualifications discussion we're having, how it's paid for. And I think all these things could, in 6 years, maybe get us to a point of equity and quality that would serve the people of Vermont much more substantially.
And just to go on record, VLCT does support regionalizing, public safety services to the degree that it makes sense in those communities. I mean, obviously there are pockets of probably Chittenden County and that would be, are perfectly capable and happy of doing things the way that they're doing it right now without added services, but there's definitely pockets of the state where it's a bit of a desert when it comes to access.
So I dare say every other county.
So yeah, we definitely support that. And I think the sheriffs are already a model. And, this might be a good opportunity to say, Roger Marcoux has been on our public safety policy committee for the league for several years, maybe close to a decade. And, he's not even a municipal official, but we include these folks because they have such a strong connection to our communities and they are providing such huge services, whether it's running, dispatching agencies or providing just contracting services to communities. And so we definitely want to help them help their counterparts as well, because I know that Mark and Roger are pretty much the gold standard. And I said to them earlier, I hope the legislature doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think there's a lot of good work that's being done, and that I personally would trust the options they would put on the table to identify where the weaknesses are and where the strengths are and sort of what to build off of. So.
Yeah, and I just want to say from my communities and what we've had to go through with our sheriff has been abysmal and horrible, and the behavior that has to be said in this conversation. As much as we want to say we love Roger and Mark, there are sheriffs that are just behaving so badly and are horrible public servants, period. And the stories that you can hear from towns in my county and others are just atrocious. So yes, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we really want to clean the baby well.
Yeah.
So
and beyond that, even the transition, I just happen to live in Orange County and we're going through this transition as well with our sheriffs. And it's not necessarily professionalism. It's like the transition in and of itself, it's a big thing. And sort of people talk, it's interesting, the conversations that in my communities are finally realizing sort of the scope of what a sheriff does and sort of what they're providing for communities. And all of a sudden, they sort of took it for granted and or didn't understand. And this is a really timely conversation at all angles.
Well, I'm gonna, if you have suggested language or, changes that you want, or additions, frankly, please run them by me and submit them, and we can talk about them at our next time, because we're gonna, need, obviously, we have to move forward with the bill, and we're limited with what we can do right now. So, and also on the constitutional amendment, when we do get the other things added, it would be great if you have, even if you want to just submit something in writing about what your thoughts are on it, that would be helpful to have that on the record. We're gonna move on unless we really.
No, I just want to make sure that we add in or consider adding language around the cost analysis. Are you giving us that language, or are we asking Jen for that about the cost analysis from HR?
Might it be good to get a fiscal note from JFO?
I will think about it and talk with Tim about how we might add that, or if we might add that, but I think we need to have HR in to talk about whether that's a thing they can do.
Yeah, or JFO can.
Thanks, Gwen.
Thanks so much.
Much appreciated.
Thanks.
The next person we have, Lauren Hibbert, here from the Secretary of State's office. Hi, Lauren. It's nice to see you.
Good afternoon.
So we wanted you to come in to weigh in specifically about one section of the bill. You're welcome to tell us what you think about anything, but about really like anything, Lauren. Exactly. But specifically the language that would task the Secretary of State's office with doing something, and then just to have a conversation about that.
Section 5.
Yeah, so section 5 on page 5 of the bill, 555.
Phenomenal. Well, good afternoon. For the record, my name is Lauren Hibbert, and I am Deputy Secretary of State. I'm glad that you only want me to speak on section 5, because that is what I'm most capable to speak on. Section 5, the Secretary of State is interested in this report. I think we could be of assistance to the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. The thing that we have feedback on in relationship to this language is it's not clear from the language what metrics we should be assessing in terms of what is required. The necessary number, how do we know what the necessary number is based on this language? Because we don't know exactly what the demands of the sheriff will be. We understand that the demands really differ from the sheriff's department to sheriff's department. So we don't know if there's going to be a reassessment of workload between the sheriffs and the state police. There's a couple of factors that are unclear to us in this bill language. So how would we determine what the necessary number of sheriffs is really outside of the Secretary of State space. It may be in the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriff's space, but even for them, it may be hard to know the number. And then the precise boundaries of any proposed districts, I think it really depends on whether the committee is thinking of sheriffs as representing an equal amount of people, or whether we need to take into account geographical boundaries. And with it's a different analysis than redistricting of votes, because sheriffs are really on the ground providing services. So we want to make sure that we would be thinking about mountain ranges and lakes and things like that. So it's a different analysis than our office typically has done when we're talking about voters, where those geographical factors may not matter as much. So our ask is just if there's more, assuming this bill moves, if there's more that this committee wants us to consider, that it be put into the bill, so that we're not making up guessing what you're asking.
Okay, that is completely fair. So geographic
Versus population, or
okay, delivery of services. What else did you say?
well, I think
What are the what are the demands of the communities? I think you were asking. It's like, how would you even know how to determine how many are necessary if you don't know what the crime rate? So,
Yeah, and I don't even think for sheriffs, it's crime rate. It's because a lot of their services aren't, they're sort of public safety more than crime.
like speeding, I mean, you have to look at all the things they're hired to do and what the demands are in those counties.
Yeah, certainly. Senator Watson.
Well, thinking about if there are national best practices around, I mean, do others, ignorant question, but do other states have sheriffs like this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there, I wonder if there are best practices nationally. You know, I think about like for teachers, there's like recommended classroom sizes, you know, how many kids can one teacher handle, you know, that kind of thing. But similarly, I wonder.
Yeah, so Senator Norris and I had a little bit of a conversation last night. Oh, I woke you up. About sort of like national, you know, is there a state that has like a model?
Yeah.
And I think the answer was, I don't want to speak for you, but do you remember this when this came up last night about
Model what, I'm sorry.
model, you know, sort of like what state has model sheriff's oversight or, you know, best practices who could we look at?
Well, it'd be Vermont, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and the answer was, oh, there's not a really good one.
No, I, when I was with the National Sheriff's Association, I used to look quite frequently. I was looking at Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina. And Georgia has a multitude of counties.
Yeah.
Georgia, a multitude. And what's similar to Georgia and Vermont is a lot of their counties are very small, so. I don't know, 40 counties on in Georgia, I would share. So, you know, I can go through they've all had their problems, they've all had their high points, they've all had, the human factor comes into play no matter which state you're going to and looking at, but in New England, New Hampshire still has a sheriff's model that actually takes care of the courts and the jails. So, I mean, they're right next door, we kind of carry us to see what they do. And Maine still has a form of county government as far as sheriffs are concerned. Connecticut simply eliminated the sheriffs. Anyways, they're not there. Massachusetts, New York still has, they're not New England obviously, but New York still has a county.
I'm wondering if there's, yeah, we could look at certainly other New England states that would probably, in maybe small states like South Carolina
We could reach out to the National Sheriff's Association.
yeah,
also.
let's see if we can get some information from national, that's a good idea.
Well, even next door in New York State, I mean, most towns in the Adirondacks don't have a police department, but there's a sheriff for every county and a robust sheriff staff.
So we can see if there are sort of, we can look into that and put some meat on these bones if we move ahead with this part of the, and would there, so Secretary, the way it's drafted now, it's Secretary of State and Office of Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. Are there other offices that you think should be consulted in this, that from your perspective?
Well,
Department of Public Safety.
I would think the Department of Public Safety should be an essential part of the conversation. And it could also include the Criminal Justice Training Council as well.
I agree.
So.
Okay, well,
In terms of, but when I look at this report, I see section 1 as really a determination. If we were to divide the work, section 1 is really being the determination of the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, and then we could help them with dividing the boundaries. But even when I got to how would we know, okay, let's say we want 5 sheriffs for the entire state. How would we know how to draw those lines? It really would be what are the functions of the sheriff in each of those districts, and what is a reasonable amount of geographic distance for a sheriff to travel to be responsible for. And then obviously the geographic, you know, we're not a flat state. We are a very mountainous, although old mountains, but we're mountainous. And we have some lakes that can divide us into 2 sort of regions depending on where we are. And I just want to make sure that as we're thinking about precise boundaries, that they're reasonable for the work that the sheriffs are being asked to do. In terms of the election of the sheriffs and you know, overseeing that, We have models where, districts that cross multiple towns, I think that can be managed from an election standpoint. It would just be, we would need time to implement those elections so that we could, plan it well. But we do have the ability to elect someone across multiple, towns and cities.
Yeah,
So that would be fine.
done that before, or to do around the edges too, yeah. Okay, Senator Clarkson.
So I actually think section 5 is premature. I think until we do Prop 1 and look at whether we want regional public safety, I think to be doing this is premature. I think that at least I hope that the objective of this bill is to reinstill integrity, qualifications, and faith in our sheriffs. Look at where they might want to be for the 21st century, how we may need them in the 21st century. I think to be redrawing boundaries and thinking about the number we need until we solve some of those other things, I think this is premature. I'm just thinking of that as we have this conversation, that we may want to do our other work first. And particularly as I think about our regional work, which we spent a lot of time on. And you've been involved with that too. So it just strikes me, this may be, we may want to do this after we've done that other.
Okay.
I have to say, not that you've asked me my opinion on that, that I agree. Because going through this work, reducing the number before we know exactly what we want them to do.
Yeah.
It's a big statutory change and culture shift, and it will require a lot of thought to provide this report to you. And this work the work of the other sections, I think needs to be done.
Excellent. Well, are there other questions for Lauren? Senator Biehoski.
I don't have a question. I do want to sort of just put a pin in for further conversation about sort of an informative report, because I do think there is a case to be made for some side-by-side work as we work on the constitutional amendment and then get a sense of what is needed when and if that passes in statute. I don't want to do the 5 years of work on the amendment and then have to begin, like, I think there's a case for some side-by-side work.
Yeah, and maybe it's not this, maybe this isn't the right question to ask right now, maybe it's more of a needs analysis or needs assessment kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah, no, I think
that.
that's a good point. So let's think about that, and we could ask our other witnesses about that too, but sort of a needs assessment for duties that are usually covered by sheriffs.
Or of law enforcement. I mean, that goes to the regional question, which is equity, the issues of equitable law enforcement, equitable access to law enforcement. So right now, our rural, and it goes back to our rural question, our rural towns, if you have a domestic violence in, Plymouth, they're gonna take forever to get there. I mean, is that equitable access? If you have a more robust and equitable system, which is, I think, what we're hopefully getting to here, you may be solving some of these
Okay.
things.
Well, we are gonna let Lauren go. Thank you very much. You spurred a nice conversation about what kind of report we want to ask for, which maybe doesn't even involve you guys.
Well, that would be lovely, but if it does involve us, we're willing partners.
Aw.
We're happy to help wherever we can.
Well,
and-
we know that another bill we're talking about is a heavy lift for you, so we'll save your energy for that. So thank you as